Okay, as I said, good morning, everybody, and Shavua Tov. Of course, we're here on the sixth Yortzeit Bo Bayom of a man who we will hear about from those who knew him best in just a moment. The sixth Yortzeit of Rabbi David M. Feldman. We would be remiss if we would begin to memorialize and remember Rabbi Feldman in his greatness without first acknowledging somebody very special. And I do so with more than a small measure of trepidation, because for those who know, there's nothing that this very, very special person would want less in this setting and in all settings than acknowledgement. The Talmud tells us that a wife brings her husband 6 very special aspects, virtues in life: simcha, joy; bracha, blessing; tova, goodness; choma, protection from the unimaginable pressures and difficulties that come along with communal service with tzarchei tzibur; even new and deeper perspectives on Torah; and sixth and finally, shalom, a sense of wholeness, peace of mind, tranquility. And certainly Aviva, Libadel ben Hachayim uven Hachayim. Aviva brought all of these qualities, and in truth so many more, to the work that she did together with her life partner, her husband, in their mission stretching from Bay Ridge to Teaneck over so many years and decades, serving the Jewish people. And Aviva, these last 6 years, has brought those very same virtues to our community. But I would add just one more, and that is ensconced within her very name itself. Aviva, of course, from the language of Aviv, from the spring, and it's especially important this morning as the title of our program, looking forward, optimism in volatile times. Aviva kishma kenhi always brings us a sense that hope does spring eternal. And in these days, which are volatile days and concerning days and days where vigilance is very much the order of the day, Aviva's sheer presence gives us and fills us with a sense of optimism and hope that better days are truly ahead. And so we are singularly honored that Aviva is here with us this morning and continues to inspire all of us through her ceaseless acts of chesed on behalf of our entire broader community. And in remembering Rabbi Feldman, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, Ishto Kegufo Dami, of course, we must honor and pay tribute to Aviva as well. And so with that, we're so grateful to the Feldman family for sharing this emotional and very nostalgic day with all of us. We'll be privileged to hear in the following order from those, as I said, who knew Rabbi Feldman the very best, from his sons, Rabbis Daniel and Jonathan, his daughter Rebecca, who I see joins us from a mere 6,000 miles away, and favorite son-in-law, Dr. Tal, on certain aspects of Rabbi Feldman and some important recent events. We'll begin in just a moment with Rabbi Daniel.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, Rabbi Feldman.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rabbi Friedman, and thank you so much for all of you've done over these years. And it's so good to be with all of you this morning. And it may seem a little unusual for a memorial event to have the title Looking Forward, but that's what's appropriate for my father, whose optimism, which is also included in the title, was so much a part of his personality and of his essence, and a big part of what we want to focus on here tonight, here this morning, depending on what time of day it is for you. And we chose the topic this year to focus on peacemaking, as that has been in the news recently. And that is something so dear to my father's heart and so much representative of what he was about and the legacy that he continues to leave us with. It's something we actually read about a little bit in last week's Parsha yesterday morning, even though there's so much that's so tense and volatile in the Parsha about sibling relationships and family relationships. But tucked within those stories, there is that episode of Yitzchak and the inhabitants in Gerar, where there is some tense back and forth, but ultimately he's able to part with them in peace. He's able to part with them b'shalom. And that theme, so much on our minds today, so much reflective of what we think about, is such a wonderful representation of my father's priorities. And he was somebody who brought peace everywhere he went. He had a unique role within his own large family and within his community and within his population in every area, among his colleagues, among his students, among his congregants, among everyone he knew, as somebody who was able to bring peace. And he did so not simply by just giving in on everything and not in any kind of a simplistic way at all. I remember when I was in high school, he was actually brought into my school to speak at a symposium, and he was asked to speak about the topic of tolerance. And he started off with a story of somebody exhibiting behavior that seemed very intolerant. And I think we all expected that the next sentence would be a critique of that apparently intolerant behavior. But what he actually went on to explain is why we need to be tolerant of that attitude that seemed to be intolerant, how to understand where that apparent intolerance came from, and how that could also fit within a atmosphere of peace. And it's evocative of the idea that Rav Kook expresses in the comments that he wrote in Maseches Brachos. There are 4 sections of the Talmud that end with the idea, which some have called maybe an example of the Talmud's sense of humor. It seems not to be true when the Gemara says, closing off these 4 tractates, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam, that Torah scholars increase peace in the world. And everyone raises the question, there's so much disputation, there's so many arguments in the Talmud. How could we ever say that Torah scholars are increasing peace? And Rav Kook explained that Torah scholars teach us that there are many different ways with which to have shalom, that shalom can coexist within many different views. But I think the point was that not only that we can all somehow get along, but it's specifically through being able to pursue that diversity of opinion in pursuit of truth that shalom is actually brought out. And my father was so fond of making reference to the Gemara Maseches Eruvin, which Daf Yomi is now completing, and we'll hear a siyum on in a few minutes, where the Gemara makes reference to the attributes of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, that Beis Hillel, we paskin like them because of their humility, even though Beis Hillel were sharper, but Beis Hillel were nochim v'aluvim yoser, that they were more modest and they had a sense of humility, and therefore we rule in accordance with them. And my father would explain that even though doesn't seem to be a reason to choose their opinion, you should choose still the one you would think is more knowledgeable or is sharper. But the point the Talmud is bringing out is that this attribute of humility, that itself is what brings one to the truth, and that ability to tolerate and to acknowledge the opinions of others, that's what brings one to the truth. And it's particularly fascinating to me that only recently we found letters that my father wrote to his father, to my grandfather, many such fascinating things. Among them is actually a letter reflecting on recent election events where he had some very interesting perspectives from a moral and halachic view of who to vote for, which I will not share in order not to cause any conflict or any misinterpretation. But there's another letter which I found very striking and meaningful, where I assume he was working on his first book, and he wrote to his father here about this idea of bringing about truth through opinions and through going back and forth. So he writes these words: I go to bed at night with Ritva and Rashba fighting around in my mind, and with Achronim recasting the work of the Rishonim. One set of shitos of opinions vies with another, and one array of rayos of proofs upsets another. Through it all, a comprehensive statement on all aspects of the subject will hopefully emerge. And that ability to search for truth through considering all of the other opinions and to do so in a way that ultimately brings about peace was so symbolic of his attitude to the world. And he didn't simply go along to get along, but he was able to get along despite not necessarily agreeing. And he took positions that were often not popular and that often really required putting himself out there. And he never hesitated to do so in the pursuit of both truth and peace at once, without ever sacrificing either one. And it was part of his unique personality that he was able to do so in a way that very few people can. And there's an idea that was pointed out by Rav Bakshi Doron, the former Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, who unfortunately passed away due to COVID a few months ago. And he noted the apparent conflict that the Talmud tells us in Maseches Erchin, not to be confused with Eruvin, but the Talmud tells us that on the one hand, when it comes to giving musar, when it comes to giving tochacha, reproof to someone, so you shouldn't say something which is not going to be received. Just as it's a mitzvah to say something which will be received, kach mitzvah lo lamar davar she'eino nishma, you shouldn't say something which is not going to be received. Yet the Talmud also says that you should be ready to give such reproof even 100 times. So the question is glaring that if you have to say it 100 times, so then it would seem that it wasn't being received, it wasn't being listened to. So how could it make sense to say at once, you shouldn't say something that's not being received, and you should say it even 100 times? And he suggested that it's a reference to the tone that you use and that the atmosphere that you convey when you're making this point, you should say it in such a way that it's so pleasant and that it's so well received that you could say it even 100 times. The person is not going to get upset with you. It can be repeated again and again, and it's still going to be taken in the proper manner and still going to be effective, and the two can be harmonized this way. I thought it could also be relevant to understanding a similar idea that in the laws of visiting the sick, of Bikur Cholim, my father was such a master and such a teacher. So you find perhaps a similar apparent contradiction, because the Talmud tells us that you should visit the sick even 100 times a day. And then at the same time, as the Rambam records, we're also told you should visit the sick, but don't do so in a way that you're going to become a burden, you're going to become overwhelming to the person. So the question is once again glaring. How could it be that you could visit someone 100 times a day and not be a burden to them? And perhaps we can make a similar suggestion that the idea is that the personality that you convey when you make these visits is such that even if you were to show up 100 times in a day, you're not going to become burdensome, they're never going to become tired of you. To be able to have such a personality that brings about such a reaction, that's perhaps what we're seeking. And the truth is, my father was able to do that in both directions. He could come 100 times a day and you wouldn't get tired of him. And also, if circumstances were such that he wouldn't be able to come that day, you would still be able to feel the love that he was trying to transmit, because that came through so prominently. And perhaps that's a part of the message that we're seeing here. And so his attribute in interacting with people, even when he disagreed, to be able to bring about this peaceful result was a factor of his personality, which exuded love that he spoke about in that wonderful speech at his Rabbi of the Year award, which my brother we're so grateful to him that he put on YouTube. And he spoke there about the idea that we have to have love for others, which is not necessarily justified, not necessarily warranted by the circumstances, and ideas often associated with Rav Kook as well as Avas Chinam, but as he noted, is also conveyed much earlier by the Navi Yeshaya that will be read in the Haftorah of the Shabbos, of where he says, Ohaveim Nedava, I will love them as a donation, so to speak, as a voluntary contribution. I will express love to them because that is who I am, that is what I do, and that is how I bring about this peaceful result. And I'll just close by noting that it made reference to Yitzchak's success in making peace with those he wasn't getting along with in this past week's Parsha. And the Medrash, the Sifrei and Dvarim, actually makes an unexpected point about that because Yitzchak had some disagreement with him, it was through that he was able to bring about peace. And the Medrash writes that we see from here that peace is brought about through tochacha, which we normally translate as rebuke, as reproof, that somehow is able to bring about peace. And the Torah Temimah, a little bit earlier in the Chumash, where there's a similar comment, the Torah Temimah was a sefer which our family is very close to, very dear to our family for many reasons. The Torah Temimah makes a comment that in the Talmud Bavli, you have the same idea, but it's expressed from a different source. That the Talmud Bavli, again over there in Maseches Erchin, makes reference to someone who said that I gave much reproof to someone, and he ended up loving me all the more. And he made reference to the pasuk in Mishlei that says Hochach la'chacham v'aveka, that you should rebuke a wise person and he will love you for it. And the Torah Temimah asks, okay, but that source is from Mishlei. We have a source here from Chumash itself, from yesterday's Parsha, from this incident with Yitzchak. How come it doesn't make reference to that verse as a source? And he suggests that maybe we're looking to Mishlei because we specifically want to involve this idea of love, this recognition that we're not talking about any kind of a harsh rebuke, but we're talking about an expression of love. It's through that one is able both to disagree and yet to bring about an atmosphere of love and of peace. And the idea of tochacha, which we do also often translate as rebuke, I think it has also been observed that it's the same word we use to mean proof. That we say something is muchrach, and we use the same word in order to make that point. And that perhaps the idea when the Torah says that we should engage in such interaction, we don't necessarily mean to rebuke someone, but we mean to prove that the position is correct. And that also reflects so well my father's interactions with others. He was never one to rebuke, never one to speak harshly, but instead was able to prove his point both through his personal behavior and his personal model, and also through the cogency of his arguments, which he was able to convey with such sweetness and such love. And it's that message that dominates and that sits with us this morning as we think about optimism and we think about looking forward, and we think as well about his love for Torah and for teaching. And with that in mind, I turn over now to my brother Jonathan to make a siyum on Maseches Eruvin.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining together in this way. Thank you to Rabbi Friedman for hosting us and for organizing us and for recognizing that this year, probably more than ever, it's important for us to see each other as best we can and to inspire each other and encourage each other as best we can. We appreciate Rabbi Friedman and his efforts, and certainly a worthy successor to the venerable pulpit of the Jewish Center of Teaneck with his own scholarship and sensitivity, certainly in the mold which the shul has become accustomed to. So thank you for joining us. It is, as Daniel mentioned, it is customary when we have a yard site to honor the occasion with the completion of a learning project. And it works out very well that today happens to be the last day of Maseches Eruvin in the Daf Yomi program. 3.5 months that we've been learning Eruvin. Right on the yard site it finishes, so that's a very appropriate opportunity for us to make a siyum, and it certainly fits very well with the theme of looking forward and optimism in difficult times, because Eruvin was some difficult times, and everyone in the Daf Yomi program is very much looking forward to moving on to Psachim and other Masechtas. But that certainly, as we're going to say Hadran Alach, as we're going to sincerely look forward to revisiting the themes of Eruvin, there's certainly a lot that we can learn from Eruvin that are appropriate ideas for us to reflect on. Right? Certainly, that the concept of an Eruv Chatzerot, of creatively joining together different boundaries, different properties, so that people can come together. Right. That's certainly something that Dad was, reflects Dad's values, and the idea of specifically using Shabbos as an opportunity. Certainly, Mom and Dad were a great team in this way. Right. Using Shabbos, using the unique nature of Shabbos as a way to reach out to the community, as a way to unite the community. Whether it's in the home or whether it's in the shul, whether it's, anyone up for a visit, anyone that can be involved in the Shabbos experience, right? And we were very fortunate to grow up in such a home, right, with two parents so dedicated to using Shabbos and using the uniqueness of Shabbos to bring together the community. And that's certainly what we're doing here again with this Zoom commemoration, right? The idea of using creativity, using technology, whether it's internet or whether it's telephone wires and poles, whatever needs to be done to get the community together, to have people feel as part of a larger whole, people feel welcome, people feel special, right? These are things that our parents are such great role models and such great activists in doing these things, and that's certainly reflected in the themes of Eruvin. The Maharsha ends. By the way, the Maharshah's yard site was yesterday. Right? We couldn't Zoom because it was Shabbos, but we can share this Zoom with the Maharsha. I think it's appropriate. But he ends Maseches Eruvin with quoting the Yerushalmi, the Talmud Yerushalmi and Eruvin, who mentions that the basis for the idea of joining together a Jewish community so that we can carry from one place to another on Shabbos, the idea is rooted in that pasuk Deracheh Darchei Noam V'chol Nesivoseh Shalom, right, which is Dad's motto. So much so that we went, the efforts we put to put that on the on his headstone, right? The Deracheh Darchei Noam, right? This was his credo, right? That peace and pleasantness were such important goals, and that this was what the Torah is about, and this was his mission, was to show people that might not understand otherwise, show people that with greater understanding, we become more aware of just how much the Torah is focused on pleasantness and peace and harmony. And these are ideas that we recognize the more we understand. And that was certainly Dad's mission in life and Dad's joy in life, was to show people that the more we understand the Torah, the more we appreciate the different values that the Torah is giving us, the more we'll understand that pleasantness and peace are the most important things. The Maharsha, by the way, writes this in the year 5376, over 400 years ago, which he points out was the Shalom, the Gematria 376, right? The year of Shalom. That the Eruvin is about Shalom. This is the idea that we are focusing on today as we finish Eruvin, as we remember such a champion of peace, such a champion of harmony that we remember today. And this idea, it's a major theme in 2020 education, is the blended learning, right? Which has a different connotation, but we're learning Eruvin. We're learning about the importance of blending, from one person's home to another person's home, from one person's heart to another person's heart, that we come together as a community. These are ideas, and as we'll say in the Hadran in just a moment, right, that this is what learning is about also. Right? We say Ha'arev na Hashem Elokeinu is divrei saraska. Right? There's a relation between the word Ha'arev na, right, that the Torah should be sweet and pleasant in our hearts and minds. That comes from putting things together. That comes from looking at the Torah as a whole and looking at aspects of the Torah in perspective and understanding, as Daniel was just mentioning before, right? And the more you put together the different thoughts of the different commentators on the Torah, and the more we synthesize the ideas and the values of the Torah, so the more it becomes sweet, the more it becomes appreciated, the more it becomes recognized for the wonderful, beautiful way of life that it is that Dad taught us every day. The last couple lines of Maseches Eruvin happen to deal with the difference between tying knots and slip knots, right? Which just makes me have to mention that Dad, of course, we remember fondly that he would never untie his necktie, not for halakhic reasons, not do the Shabbos, but because he didn't want to waste the time to untie it and retie it, right? Not, it's only a few seconds, but the lesson was so memorable. about the value of time. Right? There's so much more that we could be doing in terms of teaching Torah, spreading love, spreading hope, spreading optimism to his family, to his community. Right? Could waste time tying and retying neckties, but that's something that just came to mind as I'm finishing Maseches Eruvin. So we'll finish together. Hadron Alach Amotzei Tefillin Slikala Maseches Eruvin. Hadron Alach Maseches Eruvin v'Hadrach Alon. Datan Allah Maseches Eruvin v'Datach Alon. Lo Nisnei Sheminach Maseches Eruvin v'Lo Nisnei Sheminon. Lo Ba'al Madeim Lo Ba'al Madasi. Hadron Alach Maseches Eruvin v'Hadrach Alon. Datan Allah Maseches Eruvin v'Datach Alon. Lo Nisnei Sheminach Maseches Eruvin v'Lo Nisnei Sheminon. Lo Ba'al Madeim Lo Ba'al Madasi. Hadron Allah Maseches Eruvin v'Hadrach Alon. Datan Allah Maseches Eruvin v'Datach Alon. Lo Nisnei Sheminach Maseches Eruvin v'Lo Nisnei Sheminon. Lo Ba'al Madeim Lo Ba'al Madasi. Yiratzon L'Chanach Adonai Eloheinu B'Leim L'Sein Shepes Rascha U'Medosein B'Olam Hazeh. We say, Imanu Yolam Haba, Hanina Bar Papa, Rabbi Bar Papa, Nachman Bar Papa, Achoy Bar Papa, Abba Mori Bar Papa, Rafram Bar Papa, Rachish Bar Papa, Surucha Bar Papa, Ada Bar Papa, Daro Bar Papa, Ha'arev No Adonai Eloheinu, as to grace Aras Chabefinu, Vifithios Amcha Beis Israel, V'niyah Kulanu Anachnu, V'tze'etzoenu, V'tze'etzoe Amcha Beis Israel, Kulanu, Yodei Shemecha, V'lom Dei Sarasecha, Mi'ai Bai Sichak, V'en Mitzvasecha, Ki Yolam, Hi Li Samim, B'chukecha, L'man Lo Evosh, Yolam Lo Eshkach, V'kudech, Ki Gon Chiyisani, Baruch Atah, Adonai Lamdeni Chukecha, Amen, 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 Sel V'ed. Bo Dimanach, L'fanacha, Adonai Eloheinu, V'le'am L'sin, Shesamta Chakiram Yosh, V'beis HaMedrash, Samta Chakiram Yosh, V'karanos, Sh'anu Mashkim, V'eim Mashkim, Anu Mashkim, L'divrei Torah, V'eim Mashkim, L'garim B'telim, Anu Mamel, V'heim Mamel, Anu Mamel, M'kal M'schar, V'heim Mamel, V'heim M'kal M'schar. Anu Ratzim, V'heim Ratzim, Anu Ratzim, Chayil Mabadi, Ratzim, V'ershachas, Shem Namar, Yata Elohim Teridei, V'ershachas, Anshei Damim, U'mirma, Lo Yachatzu Yimehem, V'ani Avtach Bach, Yirotzem L'chanach, Adonai Elohai, Kishem, Shezartam, L'sayim, L'sachas, Eruvin, Gain to Israel, Haskell, L'sachas, Sisvar, Macher, L'sayimam, L'mod, L'lamed, L'shmar, L'asusu, L'kaim, L'skol, D'ibris, Hauter, Zagreava, L'zchuz, Kol HaTanoim, V'amoroi, V'samir Chacham, Yamoli, L'zari, Shlo, Samush, Atram, Mipi, Zari, V'zerazari, Ad Olam, This Siskayim B, This Alecha, Tancha Osach, Shach, Tishmor Alecha, Akitzose, He, Sisicha, Hakivi, Yirbu, Yamacha, Yosifu, Lachash, Nos Chayim, Orech, Yamim, Bimina, Bismalo, Shabachavad, Adonai Oz, Yamaitain, Adonai Barech, Esamo, Bash, Shalom. Shalom, I think, is the right word to segue us to Israel, to our beloved sister and brother-in-law in Israel. And so great to have so many friends and family from Israel joining us this morning as well. Okay.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ray Friedman. It's so nice to see my family. And by family, I mean the Feldmans, and I mean the Teenage Jewish Center. I mean the Beckers. Family that's blood relatives and communal. Just wonderful to see all of you looking well. And I'm sending my love. So thank you. I join the chorus of thanks to Ray Friedman for putting this together, not just well executed, but lovingly and respectfully. And it's not lost on us and very, very much appreciated. So I want to speak, I think, by way of introducing my husband through the lens of talking about my dad a bit. And I think it's very fitting that the holiday of Hanukkah is the holiday that's associated with my father, the holiday of Torah and of light, because my father filled our home with both of those things. And not just because he saw Torah as a source of light, which illuminated his path and our paths, but because I think some of his favorite passages and learnings from the Torah had to do with light itself. Last year, I believe Tal mentioned in his speech about the commandment to light Shabbat candles, and my father saw in that a deeper message, that with Shabbat candles comes greater harmony, because when you can see the other person, you quarrel less. And there's something very powerful about that, about being truly able to see, to remove the barriers between people. 2 years ago, when we were fortunate enough to be in Teaneck to see each other, I was cradling my newborn, Leora, also named for the connection between my father and light. The idea that to see something in a new light changes a circumstance. It changes a day. A new sunshine, a new dawn brings with it a new opportunity for peace, for optimism. And I think that my father would have liked, or perhaps did like, the etymological connection. Obviously, optimism comes from optimus, the Latin word for the best, but there's an optic element in there as well. There's the ability to see, and that frankly, what is best is what you see is best. And that is what Leora was named for, this notion of taking something and seeing it in the best light. And peace, which my husband is going to speak about, that's possible when perceptions change, when circumstances are seen in this new light. And he liked to say not only were days or circumstances, when seen in a proper light or in a better light, actually rose to meet this perception, but people. Compliment people even if they don't deserve it, because they too will rise to the value that you esteem to them. And both of those things, the shift in perception internally and the complimenting of others, makes peace possible. And the third commandment, the third teaching of Torah and light that my father really loved to quote was a Gemara in Shabbat that talked about a pregnant woman who was blind and said, please turn on the light so that the doctor can see. Now, she herself couldn't see, so she didn't know what the doctor could or couldn't see. And the Gemara there says you should turn on the light, you should violate Shabbat for her psychological well-being. And I think this is an important lesson for domestic peace, if not an international peace. Just go with it. If your wife is saying something and there's no need to understand or to convince, just go with it and overextend yourself for the psychological well-being of the other. Willingness and openness to see the possibilities of a new day can make that day rise and make the perceptions self-fulfill. And he always told me to hang in there during the dark times. I'm sad he doesn't get to share with me the fulfillment of the possibilities which he foresaw for me and instilled in me the confidence to pursue and to obtain with God's help. In particular, I so wish that he could have had much more lengthy, in-depth conversations with Tal, as they certainly share a similar worldview of realistic openness, not naive, but thoughtful, nuanced, creative optimism, and forward-looking. To see somebody or a people with a history of hostility as a potential for alliance, in turn creates the room for reality to shift to meet it. My father's strength of imagination, of optimism, matched with his characteristic smile and warmth which disarmed and diffused the tension to create a new space for harmony, for light, and for most of all, possibility that comes with infectious optimism. And with that, here is my beloved husband, Tal.
Well, thank you very much. It's a lovely to be with you again, with all of you. And it's very hard to follow Rebecca, so I'm a bit daunted about that. So I was asked to speak for a few minutes about the developments, particularly with our neighbors in the region. But I did want to start with some initial thoughts about Rabbi Feldman, Zichrono Livracha, and optimism as a framing way. The first thing I wanted to say is that it's really lovely to do a Yortzeit in the way that we are doing it for Rabbi Feldman, that it seems like every year we take a different aspect of his character and we kind of look at it from the Torah perspective, from the developments. We once did words, the importance of words. We've done peacemaking. This year we're looking at optimism. And I wanted to say a few things about optimism. First of all, from my own experience, I met Rabbi Feldman late in his life, but I can't remember a single time when I asked him how he was, and the answer wasn't wonderful or great, regardless of whether he was sitting at a table or in a hospital bed. Aviva, I spoke to her last week, and she mentioned to me that when you asked him how the day looked, even if it was gray outside, he would say it looks like a wonderful day. And in a way, I think I felt from him very much that it wasn't a lip service to put this positive shine on things. It was almost an act of will to make things that way through your words and through how you speak about them. And it was also a general awe about the potential of human beings, of the world, to make things better than they are. Rebecca said it very beautifully just now, this idea of how sometimes positive words give people a reputation to live up to. It's not just that you're spinning things in a positive way, it's through the way you see things, they become more positive. It is the way that things become more positive, and in a way, you can force a situation to be more positive simply by what you choose to focus on. And that way you elevate everyone around you. So I want to, in that spirit, say something about the recent agreements we reached with the UAE and Bahrain in particular, and talk about why they are a source of optimism to some extent. I was very fortunate to be involved in it. I did most of the drafting and negotiating of the agreements, and I was in Bahrain and Abu Dhabi and Washington for the signing ceremony. And I have been very involved in the effort to build our relationship with these countries for quite a while. So let me say a little bit about it generally, and then perhaps on the focusing on the side of optimism. You know, there has been a lot of discussion as to how this happened. How did we create these breakthroughs with the countries in the Gulf? And very often when there's a success, a lot of people try to take credit for the success. And I don't think it's a knowable thing to know what it is, what was the trigger. We can look at some factors that were very significant. If there is a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize here, it might be Khamenei of Iran, who may have done more than anything else to help Israel and the Gulf countries kind of come together to face particularly the threat from Iran. I think there's no question, I don't know how many of you know this, but there's no question that the fact that for over 20 years, there was this effort to cultivate this relationship by people in the foreign ministry like me, but many others, and in the defense ministry and others, that in a way this was the culmination of a long, long process of building a relationship. There's no question that the US administration invested a tremendous amount of effort in this and deserves a lot of credit for it as well. But there's also something more basic that was the trigger for these relationships. And that is that the reason why there wasn't a breakthrough to peace with the UAE and Bahrain didn't really have to do with the relations between the UAE and Bahrain, but had to do with a different conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I want to mention the first aspect of optimism related to this conflict, which actually has to do with the way normalization with the Arab world has been played in the region for a long time. For many decades now, there's been this idea that normalization between Israel and the Arab countries should be offered as a kind of pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. It should be an incentive for Israelis to reach a deal with the Palestinians. And if you reverse the order and enable Israelis to connect with Arabs in the Arab world, you will somehow remove the incentive for reaching peace with the Gulf states. So I don't think it was ever true, that myth, and it's certainly been proven not true, I think, now. But the reason why it wasn't largely true was that Israelis didn't find it believable. For most Israelis, the idea that at some distant future there would be normalization was overwhelmed by the feeling and the hostility that the region kind of broadcast to it on a daily basis. So it felt like just words. And I think the importance of what has happened with the UAE and Bahrain is that it has made that feel real, feel possible. I often say that one of the biggest challenges Israel faces in the conflict, and one of the things we face most in this conflict, is not how to produce change, but how to generate a belief in the possibility of change. If you think that the conflict is a permanent part of the landscape, if you think that change is not possible, you have no expectation for it. And this ties, of course, to a key ingredient of optimism. Optimism begins with the belief in the possibility of change. And I think the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain have made Israelis feel, for the first time in a long time, that things do not have to be as they are. It reminds me a little bit of Aesop's fable, that famous fable where the sun and the wind compete as to who can take a man's coat off. And the wind blows very hard and it makes the man hold on to his coat only harder. And then the sun comes out, and by sheer heat of the sun, the man wants to take his coat off. So the conditions themselves, in this case, are producing that kind of optimism that change is possible. And not by accident, I've been devoting my last weeks to kind of turning this agreement into a reality for Israelis in real terms, not just a piece of paper. As important as our agreements with Jordan and Egypt are, we never translated them into a warm peace. But with our Bahraini colleagues who were just here last week, and the Emiratis who visited a couple of weeks ago, we are immediately turning it into something tangible that you can feel. One of the things I've worked on most is a visa waiver agreement, which was approved by the government today. The UAE will be the first Arab country that Israelis do not need a visa to visit for. I worry that the Emiratis will live to regret the decision to make that agreement. I don't know of any family who isn't going to Abu Dhabi for Hanukkah. But this is an example of how Israelis are able to make the possibility that the region could be different feel tangible to them, and makes it so much easier to believe that this kind of more far-reaching change is also possible. A second aspect of the agreements that I think is very important, probably my favorite kind of clause in the agreements, is actually in the preamble, where it says that both sides recognize that the Jewish and Arab peoples are descendants of a common ancestor, Abraham, and in that spirit will advance the goal of coexistence throughout the region between all peoples. Now, that may sound a little bit wishy-washy, but I think it's actually quite an amazing sentence to have in an agreement with an Arab state. As you all know, we face an Arab world where the very idea of legitimacy of Jewish peoplehood is contested, and it takes courage to even speak it. And the greater idea that the Jewish people belong to the Middle East, are part and parcel of this part of the world, has been an obstacle in our negotiations with the Palestinians and with our neighbors for a very long time. And I feel like that sentence in the agreement is a kind of the ultimate message to those who are denying the Jewish people's legitimacy, right to self-determination, right to statehood, and belonging in the region. And I also want to tie it to optimism, in the sense that the way to give someone a sense of optimism has a lot to do with the way Rebecca spoke before about how you make people feel. If you feel like you see them, you see their potential, you see that they belong and they are legitimate, then you bring out a certain element in them, a certain positive side of them. And I think that this agreement essentially is pushing Israelis to imagine their future in this way, because there is that kind of positive reinforcement. And in that sense, I think it's very significant. There are obviously lots of other aspects of the agreements, but I don't want to take too much time. I do think that this trend will continue into the next US administration. Something has been broken, something good has been broken, and something positive can be built out of that. I want to end with saying something about optimism a little bit more specifically. You know, when I speak to US audiences, there is always someone who puts their hand up at the end and says, Tal, you haven't given me enough optimism, you haven't given me hope. There's this kind of unwritten rule when you speak to American audiences that you have to end on a note of hope. And a lot of Israeli speakers don't really know about this rule. They think their job is to kind of tell everybody how complicated things are in the Middle East and how they have some inside knowledge to make sure that you know that things are worse than they actually are. And this obligation to think about being optimistic is kind of tricky for people, because I think Israelis kind of pride themselves on a certain pessimism, right? Pessimism is associated with being street smart, with being wise. You have experience, and therefore you know that things are not going to be good, right? And it's quite hard to be optimistic and be realistic at the same time and be understood as realistic, especially if you're an Israeli, right? And speaking to an audience. But I wanted to say that I think that there are two kinds of optimism. There is the optimism that you sometimes hear, frankly, in America and elsewhere, which is a little bit saccharine. And it's like, I'm optimistic because, you know, all we need to do is get the leaders in a room and we can reach an agreement, or democracy is coming to the Middle East. that kind of glass is half full optimism. And then there's a second kind of optimism, which is that optimism which says, I'm optimistic not because the glass is half full, but because there are opportunities to put water in the glass. What makes me optimistic, what makes a person optimistic isn't exactly a judgment, a positive judgment of a situation. It is an attempt to alter the situation by force of your attitude towards it. And I think that's the key to thinking about Rabbi Feldman's optimism, but also Israel's chance at being optimistic. It is very dangerous in the Middle East, and generally, I would say, to be optimistic in a kind of blind way, just to assume things are good and going to be good. You'll miss a lot. But there is the kind of optimism that says we have within us the potential to alter this situation. And the optimism comes from getting to work and believing that your work makes a difference. You know, Churchill famously said that a pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity, and an optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. And we have gone through a very difficult year as a people, as a Jewish community. And I think that the challenge we face really with Rabbi Feldman's inspiration is not to minimize how hard things are, but to recognize that by force of our will, by force of our attitude, we can actually see opportunities for growth even in the hardest times, and build for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, a better future simply by the choices we make about how to look at the reality, even if it's a hard reality. And I think Israel has the opportunity today, given this opening, to actually improve its reality very, very significantly. And the trick is to be open to it, to be open to the kind of light that Rebecca spoke about to come into our lives. So thank you very much.
I want to thank the entire Feldman family, Rabbis Daniel and Jonathan, Rebecca, and Dr. Tal, in two different ways. First of all, for sharing on what's obviously a very emotional day. So in the immediate sense, thank you for sharing your thoughts and feelings and of your father with us today. We could all, as was expressed by everybody, use that sense of being anchored by an Ilan Gadol. Our rabbis always refer to a great person with that image of a tree that provides such anchoring, succor, and sustenance. And we so appreciate you giving us of your father on this day when we all need that feeling of being anchored in these truly volatile times. But in a broader sense, beyond just thanking you for today and picking up on Rebecca's note of Hanukkah and Yamim Tovim B'Halal V'Hoda'ah, a general theme of gratitude, we're really grateful to you because you've reversed the natural course of events. Rashi so famously comments at the beginning of the parsha that we'll read next week, Vayetzi Yaakov mi Beersheba, that when a tzaddik leaves a place, it's only natural that illumination is lost. Panaziva, Panahoda, Panahadra. We should have expected that because of the great loss of 6 years ago to this day, that we should have less light right now. But as the Torah tells us in Parshas Baloscha, that the menorah was constructed in a very organic and cohesive way. And all the branches, the Rabbi Daniels, Rabbi Jonathan, Rebecca, and Tal, El Mul Pnei HaMenorah Ya'iru Shivas HaNeros, they continue to illuminate because their light is pointed towards the center, towards the memory of their father, and towards their beloved mother, who should continue to live and to be well. So instead of experiencing Panaziva, a diminishment, a diminution of light, our entire community experiences through these absolutely exceptional peiros, the fruits of the Ilan Gadol that we remember today, our community continues to experience both here and in Israel and all over the Middle East, literally, the fruits of the exceptional life and legacy of Rabbi David M. Feldman. Yehi Zichro Baruch. May his memory continue to be a blessing and to continue to illuminate us, especially in these times. I'm now going to open up the chat. People can send messages to each other, and especially to the Feldman family. I know some people had wanted to send messages before, and I want to thank everybody for joining us for this very special tribute this morning. Okay, the chat should now be open. And just to continue with this theme, everybody can now unmute themselves. I know this risks cacophony, but if people want to be able to vocalize a message as well, this is a great Zoom risk, but we'll take leaps.
I'd like to introduce Emmy Leela Weber, who's now 9 weeks old, to the community.
Beautiful.
Say hello. I'm going to mute myself before she starts crying. Yeah.